Hello, everybody. My name is Nate Golden. I'm a research associate at the UBI Center, and I have worked pretty heavily on this basic income builder, which I'm going to present to you today. So let's get to it. I'm going to start by kind of giving you the purpose and the goals we have for this calculator and a little bit of the design, what's under the hood, and how it operates. I'll do a walkthrough of the calculator, and then I'll let you know some of the goals we have for future improvements. So the purpose of this calculator is to give the power of programmers to non-programmers. If you are good with data science, you can do a lot of these micro simulations to see how different policies impact the country, the state, etc. But if you don't have those skills, you may not be able to do that. So the goal here is to make a user-friendly app that anyone can use. We create this app by using 3 years of the ASEC data, which is collected by the Census Bureau and has a variety of economic data that allow us to conduct some simulations around tax reforms and benefit reforms. And we use 3 years of data so that when we do the state level reforms that we can be confident in our numbers based on the sample size. The app is designed using Plotly Dash, which is a great piece of software that allows you to create this completely in Python, which was really awesome. And how the app works, which I'll get more into in a second, is it allows you to change the tax code, change the benefit system, and it automatically takes any benefit or any new revenue and funds a budget neutral UBI. So let's take a quick look at this calculator, which there'll be a link in the comment section for you to explore it yourself. So we call this the basic income builder, and it starts with having you enter 4 inputs, or 4 types of inputs, I guess, more than 4 inputs. So you're going to start by selecting the state that you want to see and how it's affected. It defaults to the US as a whole, but you can see you can select any state and Washington, D.C. We'll just keep the US. And then it's going to ask you to choose your reform level. Is this a reform at the federal government level, or is it a state level reform? We'll start with a federal level reform so you can see that, but I'll also model a state reform. In this second box, this is where you deal with changing the tax code. So you could add, repeal our current federal income taxes by selecting this box. And you can see that the calculator starts to calculate things in real time. So let's go over what these numbers mean down here. This is the total funds. It's negative right now because we just repealed the income tax code. There's no income taxes. There's 316 million people in our UBI population. And our monthly UBI is actually negative, or a head tax, because we repealed the current income tax code. Our calculator is automatically making up for that lost revenue with a negative UBI. This leaves only 26% of people better off. We're repealing the income taxes and charging a head tax. That kind of makes sense that the majority of people are worse off. And the average change in resources per person is 0 because this is budget neutral. This number will really only change when we're looking at states with federal level reform. So I'll go into that in a second. So this is kind of the snapshot. And down here, you get a little bit of an economic overview. When we repeal the income tax code and charge a head tax, this obviously has a pretty big negative impact on poverty. The poverty rate increases, the poverty gap increases, inequality increases. And you can see these breakouts down here. Child poverty increases, adult poverty increases, people with disabilities, white, black, Hispanic. So repealing the income tax code and replacing it with a head tax seems pretty regressive. You can also, so let's unrepeal the income tax, and we're back to 0. You can also repeal employee side payroll taxes, or FICA. This looks to be a little bit more progressive, but it's still very regressive overall. And then this is where you can add new taxes to replace those. So let's repeal the current income taxes and replace it maybe with a 20%. This is a flat tax here. So it's going to tax all income equally. So we have a 20% flat income tax that's replacing the income tax code. There's extra revenue here of 864 billion. and it takes that extra revenue and it disperses it evenly amongst this 316 million people, which is $228 a month. You can see that this flat tax and UBI replacing the income tax code is actually pretty progressive. Poverty rate falls by 20%, the poverty gap falls by 30%, and the Gini index, which is a measure of inequality, falls by about 2%, and you can see our breakout groups here. So you can see if we make the tax larger, so we change this to 30%, the UBI, the funds for the UBI get bigger, the UBI itself gets bigger, the impact on poverty and inequality is larger as well. In our next box here, you can repeal benefits. So say you think that some of these current benefits would be better to be replaced by universal basic income, you can repeal them. So let's say I want to repeal SNAP, which is more commonly known as food stamps. It's restrictive. And you can see when I repeal SNAP, it adds about $7 a month to the UBI per person. And I'm also going to repeal unemployment benefits. And this also increases our UBI by about $5 a month. And you can see that poverty rate and the poverty gap keep on falling. Child poverty is down 80% in this model. Now, speaking of children, the last box lets you decide who you want to include in the UBI. We default to including all people so that it's truly universal, includes non-citizens, children, and adults, but you can change that. Andrew Yang's universal basic income did not include non-citizens or children. And what's interesting is when you stop including them, the UBI obviously gets bigger because its UBI population decreased. There was 316 million people. Now we're only giving it to adult citizens. That's 224 million people. When we exclude children and non-citizens, the impact on poverty and inequality really shrinks. So you can see these numbers were in the 60s, and now they've fallen into the 20s and 30s. Child poverty actually increases under this model by 21%. So if you say, oh, that's not good, I don't want to increase child poverty, you might be inclined to include children, include non-citizens, and you can see just with the same level of funding, by including children and non-citizens, child poverty falls by 80% if we include everyone. It increases by 20% if we don't include children and non-citizens. So that's a little bit about the federal level reforms. Let's reset all of these. Maybe we could use a reset button on here. And let's look at a state level. Oh, actually, sorry, I wanted to do one more thing. Let me show you one more thing. Let's just say we had a 10%. We kept everything the same, but we added a 10% flat tax to fund a universal basic income of $287 a month. So right now, this average resources per person is 0. If I switch to a state, let's choose a poorer state like Alabama. You can see in this situation, Alabama gains $553 per person. Average change in resources per person is positive. That's because Alabama is receiving more money from the universal basic income than it's paying in this tax increase. So this is a really progressive policy for Alabama. It cuts poverty by more than half, shrinks inequality by 16%, and it's pouring $553 per person into the Alabama economy. But when we look at a richer state, let's say Connecticut, which has a lot of rich people who are going to pay a lot more in taxes with this 10% tax, actually sees $775 per person leave. But even though Connecticut is losing money, the flat tax and universal basic income is so progressive that it still cuts poverty by about half. So that's interesting where you say, oh, money is flowing out of Connecticut, but because the reform is so progressive, we're still cutting poverty in half, which is pretty remarkable. Okay, let's reset this and let's look at a state level reform. I live in Maryland now, so I'm going to choose Maryland. And I'm going to select state level. Now, you can see when I select state level, a few things get grayed out. Maryland does not collect employee-side payroll taxes, so I cannot repeal them. And these are all federal benefits, so it does not let me repeal these either. So really, the changes here just come with the income tax. Right now, Maryland has a progressive income tax. I can repeal that. And they'd have to replace that with a $223 head tax. That's probably not ideal. So let's add a 5% income tax. We still haven't matched the revenue, so let's go to 7. Or 8%. Okay. So actually, let's do something different. Let's leave the income tax and just keep it simple. We're just going to keep everything in the same in Maryland. So we're going to add a 1% tax and use it to fund a universal basic income. Right now, that's $36 a month. You can see how this impacts Maryland. Pretty awesome. Cuts in poverty. It's smaller cuts than we saw before, but this is just a 1% tax. Well, say you want to be a little bit more targeted with your reform and say, hey, let's just take that 1% and let's funnel it into kids. So I can not include non-citizens. Well, let's include non-citizens, but only children. And so this is including children who are non-citizens and children who are citizens. All children. This child allowance. You can see that we cut the poverty rate by 11%. Each kid is getting $158 a month. Poverty gap by 5%. Gini index falls by 2%. But look at child poverty, falls by more than a third. This 1% tax in Maryland could cut child poverty by more than a third. That's pretty great. Yeah, so that's how you use the calculator for state level and federal level reforms. There's millions of possible outcomes on here. You could literally play with it for the rest of your life and not check them all. So, try some reforms and see how you can cut poverty and inequality in your state and across the country. So I hope you like the calculator, but there are some ways that we want to improve it. First, we want to adjust for the underreporting of income and benefits. So I don't know if you noticed, but when I repeal federal income taxes, it only counts $1.3 trillion. In reality, they raise closer to $2 trillion. So we know that not only are income taxes being underreported, but income itself. When we sum the aggregate income in the data set, we get about $12 trillion. And that is pretty substantially short of what we see in reality. So we're hoping to adjust for that a little bit, because what that's doing is, a 10% flat tax, it's actually underestimating the total UBI that you would get. And it's the same with benefits. Benefits are also underreported. So when you repeal SNAP or you repeal the earned income tax credit or whatever, that isn't large enough that we see in the real world. So it shrinks the size of the UBI, and it just doesn't make our data as accurate. So we're hoping to adjust for that. Another thing we're hoping to do is merge that ASEC data that I was talking about before with other micro data sets, so that we can add different tax options. So maybe different income tax reforms for starters, but also maybe a consumption tax like a VAT, a carbon tax, possibly a wealth tax, or even a land tax, to give the user as many possible ways to fund a universal basic income as possible. Right now, the model doesn't include behavioral responses, but if we increase taxes, people are going to respond to that. So we would like to include some behavioral responses in the future. That will, in order to do that, we'll need to understand people's marginal tax rates better, and that's in progress, but it's a little bit complicated, so hopefully we can add that in the future. And then we'd also like to let people zoom in even closer than the state level. How does this policy affect your congressional district? Or how does it affect your state legislator district? We have the capability to do that. We'd love to add it to the calculator and maybe add some more economic data as well, so you can really see the impact of these reforms. That is a brief overview of our basic income calculator. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck using it, and thank you for listening.